Hey guys, thanks so much for coming to this early talk, so early in the morning, and thanks for coming to see me in spite of my not physically being there to talk to you. So today I'm gonna try to make the case for a particular theory of consciousness, sometimes called internalism, sometimes non-relationism, and simultaneously try to counter-exemplify what I take to be the reigning theory of the reigning physicalist theory of consciousness, namely representationalism. So here's what I'm going to be doing today, and I'll try to stick to the script. I hope you all managed to get a copy. I want to say that there are some findings from cognitive neuroscience that at once counter-exemplify the representationalist theory of consciousness, which, for those of you unfamiliar, says no change in phenomenology without a change in representational content. And I want to provide positive support for a rival theory of consciousness, non-relationism. Some of you, again, might have seen this called internalism elsewhere, which says that phenomenology is determined by vehicle, in other words, neural properties. So that's the theory I want to be defending by giving counterexamples to representationalism. So what I want to do is just three things. First, explain a bit of the workings of the proposed neural mechanisms responsible for the relevant experience types, these experience types that I take to be counter-exemplary to representationalism. And next I want to explain how I think the relevant counter-exemplification works. That'll be the second part of the talk. And finally, I want to say that how I think this discovery of this particular bit of data from cognitive neuroscience positively evidences non-relationism. So let's get to it. If you do have this handout, I don't know if it'll have been printed in color. If it isn't in color, this little diagram that we're going to be coming up on in just a second is labeled where the various color states go in this experience space. So I might raise my diagram, my colored copy, up to the screen in just a second. But anyway, the relevant data, the relevant experience states, which I take to be counter-exemplary to representationalism, come from an exploration of Paul Churchland's of the Hurwitz-Jameson color space, or the Hurwitz-Jameson phenomenological color space, whatever you want to call it, which is a, well, we'll get to what it is in just a second. And anyway, this talk and my conclusions are inspired by Paul Churchland's discussion of a similar issue in his article on the chimerical colors in his 2007 Neurophilosophy at Work book, which has several essays in it. And his target in the essay is dualism, or property dualism, or any kind of dualism, which usually is grounded on this claim that physicalists can never get any phenomenal facts to be entailed from a physical base of facts. Churchland takes himself to do just that in the article I just mentioned, Chimerical Colors. And what he doesn't do is take his conclusions to bear, or at least he doesn't explicitly mention that he takes his conclusions to bear on physicalist theories as well. And I've written an essay or two on just that, because I think there are pretty big implications among physicalist theories of consciousness borne on by these predictions and these interesting data from Paul Churchland's discussion of the Hurwitz-Jameson phenomenological color space. So we'll get to those soon, those implications. So let's get to the chimerical colors, how to elicit them. We won't have time to do that in this room or in this talk. But if you do have time afterwards, at your hotel or something, you should check out chimerical colors and try to elicit these unusual experiential states for yourselves. So, the Hurwitz-Jameson phenomenological color space, or the HJ space for short, it's a three-dimensional neural activation space instantiated by some layer of neurons early on in the visual pathway. So maybe maybe V1, maybe LGN, but I'll get to that in a second. And this space houses all of our possible color experiential states. The dimensions of the HJ space correspond to 3 neuron types, the types being individuated in accordance with the sensitivities that the neurons bear to retinal stimuli. Each cell's resting energy is 50% of maximum, thus allowing for excitation and inhibition of the cell. One cell gets excited, or one cell type in this layer, which realizes the proposed space. One cell type gets excited by yellow, incoming stimuli from retinal projections, and inhibited by blue. That's one of the 3. Another gets excited by red and inhibited by yellow. And the last cell type basically gets excited by white and inhibited by black. The activation space realized by these 3 opponency neurons looks like this diagram that should be on your handout. And if it is black and white, it shouldn't be, again, so bad because these states are labeled, but it looks roughly like that. I don't know how it's coming out on the screen, but that's what the diagram is. This is the space of our color experience. This is the cognitive neuromechanism responsible for human color experience, or this is the diagram of it in any case. You'll notice a conspicuous subvolume in the greater 3-dimensional space. The colored in egg-shaped subvolume, that is a depiction of all the states the neural layer realizes which might be produced in broad daylight and the like. Basically, all states in the business of representing properties of external objects. These are also going to correspond to those states which might be elicited in nighttime settings. I don't know if the ambient illuminant matters so much, because if you were looking at, say, some hue in the middle of that space, say a fully saturated mid-brightness orange, and then the ambient illuminant were to decrease, or say it gets darker in your environment, that would just send you further down into that conspicuous subvolume, that egg, which I'll call the HJ egg, and you'd still be in a spot, you'd be in a state thereafter, which we'd still might say in broad daylight would represent some surface or other, and in the illumination that you're in still represents some surface or other. So it doesn't have to be broad daylight. It could be in any illuminant. You'll be in this space, this egg. Anyway, a consequence of color opponency neurons getting tugged out of their resting energies for too long is they get fatigued or potentiated. What fatigue and potentiation amount to is cells overcompensating upon subsequent downstream stimulation. So if you stare at yellow for too long, you might fatigue or potentiate some cell. And this is just to say that if you stared at some color too long and fatigued or potentiated some cell type in this layer that realizes this space, whatever you look at next will be affected accordingly. So these instances of overcompensation, so after you fatigued or potentiated some cell and then you look at some other thing and it's affected thereby, these instances of overcompensation, they're just your usual stock of after images. This is how you create after images. At least it's one way, maybe the most common. The hue of what after image you get is determined by this: how far the color you've stared at for too long is from the middle of the HJ egg, and the location in the HJ egg of the color subsequently stared at. Okay. So the chimerical colors, as Churchland calls them, are special cases of this process. They're results of staring at a color after fatiguing or potentiating some opponency neuron or other, the distance from middle gray of which sends subsequent activation outside the conspicuous subvolume we've been looking at for just a second. Some of these states seem distinctly hued and yet as dark as black. Some of them seem more hued, as it were, than the hues they appear to exhibit. So you can imagine entering a state that seems more orange than a fully saturated orange, or more blue than fully saturated blue, and so on. And some of them appear distinctly hued and yet white as white. Churchland Churchland goes into lots of details in the original article with explaining just how conceptually odd or contradictory even a lot of these descriptions are. So these are states we predict on the basis of the HJ space. We know about the diagram and the representation, the diagrammatic representation and the locating in this cognitive neuromechanism of all the normal states. But now we look at this HJ space for long enough and talk about the neural mechanisms responsible for realizing the space for long enough, and we decide, or we determine, oh, maybe we can induce some really unusual, novel experiential states on the basis of what these neural mechanisms, on what the basis of this model tells us. We can get outside that egg, which is, again, is the diagrammatic depiction of all those states, which we might think of as being representational of being elicited directly by properties in the environment. Elicited directly is important. Okay. Again, there's no time to elicit these states in the room right now, but please feel free to check them out later. They're very unusual. Now here's what I want to say. We have these states outside the conspicuous subvolume of the HJ space. Some of them are hued and yet impossibly dark. Some of them are more hued, as it were, than a fully saturated variant of that same color type. And some of them are hued and yet impossibly white, we could say. Here's what's important about them. If the HJ egg, the conspicuous subvolume, is a depiction of all and only those states which possibly represent external object properties, then any state outside of it is a non-representational state. There are no surfaces or phenomena in the world that they represent. That's all I want to say for now. What I'm going to do in this talk is focus on the third stage, because you'll notice that if that's my argument against representationalism, that is painfully hasty. So I'll have something to say about all that haste anon. I also want to say this. Here's what's most important to me as bears on, deciding between physicalist theories of consciousness. It's this. Before we experience, say, Stygian blue, which is a state we would characterize as being distinctly blue and yet dark as black, we can predict that it would be distinctly blue and yet dark as black. The same goes for all the chimerical colors. We can predict what they will be like. Nota bene, this is the future and plural tense of what it's like, before we experience them. And we predicted them on the basis of facts about how color opponency neurons work. This then is a case of neural facts entailing phenomenal ones. This, that is a case which evidences the theory of consciousness non-relationism, which says the phenomenal facts are entailed by neural ones. And unless representationalism is compatible with non-relationism on this matter, which is an issue I won't be exploring today, but I suffice it to say for present purposes that I don't think it is, then this looks like a strike against the former by way of being a tick for the latter. So, just to quickly recap those last 2 points, the chimerical color experiences, those weird states that you can elicit by interesting means outside the HJ egg, there's nothing in the world that they could represent. There's nothing which would directly elicit those states. I think that's going to count against representationalism by way of being counterexamples to the theory, to the thesis. More importantly, these states are predicted by, are entailed by, the HJ mechanism in all its neural details. What that's going to mean is that we have, as non-relationism entails, neural facts entailing conscious ones. That to me is huge evidence in favor of non-relationism. I take it to be, and again I won't have time to argue today, a consequence of representationalism that probably shouldn't be happening. discoveries of the correlates of consciousness are always a posteriori. Okay, now I'd like to respond to what I think are the most salient objections, the most self-recommending problems with what I've just said. First, against stage 2, wherein I said that the chimerical color states are counter-exemplary to representationalism. Against that, the obvious objection is that so long as different chimerical color states predicate different things of the world, and they certainly do seem to, Russellian and Fregean versions of representationalism can handle them, can accommodate them pretty easily, as can quasi-representationalist theses like Ties from 2015, wherein he says all that's required for basically what conscious states are going to do, if they're different phenomenologically, they will be different predicatively. They'll predicate different things of the world. And you do see that in the cases that we've looked at. We have a blue that's as dark as black, or a yellow that's as white, an orange more orange than orange. These states all seem to say of whatever state at the time they're causally covariant with, that surface or that thing that's being looked at exhibits those properties. Or let's say they seem to these chimerical states seem to predicate of the surfaces with which they're simultaneous, that the surface exhibits that color. So if you're looking at a little patch, a little panel on a page over which I'll say imposed is your chimerical state, so long as the different states seem to say, hey, this surface is a different color, as it were, then representationalism's fine. Okay. All I have to say in response to this idea that so long as these states seem to say of the world different things, or predicate of the world different properties, or what have you, is that it doesn't seem to capture at least a naive spirit of representationalism, which says that conscious states are there to represent the world. Conscious states represent the world. There are things in the world that experiential states stand for. I think it's the nice idiomatic synonym for content. Susanna Siegel, in her 2010 book on vision, which should be in the bibliography there, says that no matter what construal of content we opt for, whether it be Russellian propositions, Fregean senses, possible worlds, no matter which we opt for, which construal of content, the whole purpose of adverting to these abstracta in the first place is to specify correctness conditions. This is what she says in her 2010, and again, she's a representationalist par excellence. If I'm not misremembering, she doesn't argue for that claim, but this is a representationalist saying that this is what content is for in a representationalist framework. It's for specifying the correctness conditions of a state, of an experiential state, conscious state, whatever. And if that's right, then the chimerical color states are bad for representationalism, because there's no things in the world which could directly elicit these states. These states are never correct. They could never be correct. You could never have some surface at once reflecting light in such a way as to cause a blue hue or an experience as of blue, and yet be as dark as black, because in order for a surface to do that, it's got to be doing something completely different. And so on with all the other chimerical states. So if Siegel's right that the point of content the point of adverting to these abstracta is just to specify correctness conditions. Well, there are no correctness conditions for the chimerical states, so they are trouble. Again, I don't have time to argue that she is right about that. That'll have to be for another time. But I sympathize, I guess, with the representationalist who's unfazed by those kinds of considerations. They might think aversion to content just falls out of what's been said about consciousness as being representational from the beginning. But I want to focus on this last stage and the objection to it. In the last stage, I say what's more important about these data is that they directly evidence non-relationism, because these states are entailed by facts about neurons, facts about neurology. So let me read this. If it's not neural facts alone, but say neural facts teamed or in conjunction with some other important kind of fact or important kind of knowledge which entail these novel phenomenal states, then it doesn't look like this is going to be so much of a victory for non-relationism after all, particularly if it's neural facts in conjunction with representational ones which do the entailing to Q, say, to these novel phenomenal states. So I want to say this. Obviously, if we didn't know, for example, what green was like, we wouldn't be able to do much with the knowledge that some chimerical state was green and yet as dark as black. We need to enter this discussion prepared with a sizable stock of phenomenal knowledge. The way I see this objection going is saying that that prepared stock of phenomenal knowledge necessary for comprehending the chimerical color predictions is knowledge of a representational kind. If this is right, then it's not neural facts alone which entail the what its likeness of the chimerical states, but neural facts teamed with representational ones, or with representational knowledge, because representational facts seems to imply that we need to know what it is that's represented, and what it is the color experiences represent is a notoriously tricky issue. My response to this is just that I have two, but at first take, I'm thinking that sounds pretty ad hoc. Because if you were to be a physicalist, say, reading through Churchland's article on the chimerical colors, I don't think it would pop into anyone's head that it wasn't the Hurwitz-Jameson model which allowed for these predictions. It was this whole wealth of representational knowledge to boot. That feels like that sort of response could only be elicited in the context of this kind of conversation when they're on the defense. But second, and more substantially, I don't know if the non-relationist needs what the objector seems to be implying she does, namely a thorough, robust understanding and first-hand acquaintance with the experience states depicted by the HJ egg. Sure, having been in the states depicted by the HJ egg, i.e. the conspicuous subvolume of the HJ space, in other words, having experienced multiple colors before, will give you a deeper appreciation of just what the predictions are saying. Having experienced, for example, black before, and further, blue, might enable you to engage in imaginative episodes wherein you try to predict what it would be like to first personally experience a Stygian blue, but I don't think it matters how well you engage in these exercises. Here's all I think the non-relationist needs for the chimerical colors to be a case of neural facts entailing phenomenal ones, which supports her thesis. Take a completely blind neuroscientist, Bob. Bob knows that the HJ space is populated with what regions it's populated by, and knows that sighted people say that those states have certain experiential qualities, just like his oral, gustatory, olfactory, and tactile states do. If Bob knows about the chemical workings of opponency neurons, then he should be just as able as was Churchland to predict that if someone fixates on a small blue surface for a while and subsequently foveates on black, that she should be in a state that for her is distinctly red and yet as dark as black. These neural details entail, on their own, what the chimerical states are like. This story has the defect, admittedly, of involving sighted people's phenomenal knowledge furnishing the HJ space in the first place, in order for Bob to make his unsurprising predictions. We could, however, strip back the story of certain details and have Bob painfully slowly examine sighted people's fifth sense on his own. He's nigh omniscient, say, like Jackson's Mary. And end up predicting that were his subjects to stare at surface reflectance profile P for long enough, and then a surface which reflects nothing, that she would describe the resultant state as being thus. This is neurons enabling, without representational knowledge of the kind seemingly requested by my objector, phenomenal facts. Asking for more than this, and this will be debatable, but asking for more than this is asking non-relationism to provide an impossible case of entailment, of P's entailing Q in such a way that property dualists apparently require, one where, per impossibile, the third personal facts of physical science entail a sentence which is not third personal. Neural facts won't give you that, obviously. But this only counts against the case for non-relationism if it counts against physicalism, and it doesn't count against physicalism. Or in any case, it is only very few physicalists who think P ought to entail Q in such a way. I know I've gone over my time by just a little bit, but thank you guys. I look forward to reading whatever comments you guys have. Thanks so much.